Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into totalitarianism.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, it's a concept that's pretty fascinating and also maybe a little unsettling.
I would agree with that assessment, yeah.
So to guide us on this deep dive, we've got a couple of sources. We've got Encyclopedia Britannica and a document just called totalitarianism.pdf.
Sounds promising.
Yeah. So our mission today is to really understand what totalitarianism is, how it works, how it compares to other forms of kind of authoritarian rule.
I think that's a great goal because the word gets thrown around a lot these days, but, what does it actually mean? What are we really talking about here?
Right. And I think that's a great point because it is more than just like a mean dictator calling the shots, right? It's a regime that wants to like control every single aspect of life, from your job to your family to what you're thinking even.
Yeah, exactly. It's about controlling every aspect of life, both public and private.
So it's not just about limiting your freedom, but it's also about actually shaping who you are as a person.
Yeah, you could say that.
Encyclopedia Britannica actually defines totalitarianism as a form of government that theoretically permits no individual freedom and that seeks to subordinate all aspects of individual life to the authority of the state.
Wow. That's
It's
it's a
intense.
very comprehensive definition for sure. No stone unturned.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it makes me think of course, that famous quote by Mussolini, all within the state, none outside the state, none against the state.
Oh, yeah.
He really kind of nailed that feeling of just being completely, like, enveloped by the state.
Totally, yeah. But how does that actually like play out in practice?
Well, what makes a totalitarian regime tick? I think our PDF document kind of gives us some clues. It highlights some key characteristics.
Yeah, okay, lay it on me.
All right, so for one, there's always this really strong central rule, power concentrated in the hands of either an individual or a very small group.
Oh, okay. So we see that in a lot of historical examples, right? Like,
Hmm.
I'm thinking like the Mauryan dynasty in India or like the Qin dynasty in China.
Yeah, good examples. But I think, they didn't necessarily have that, like, very 20th century all-encompassing control that we often associate with totalitarianism.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So maybe the methods of control have evolved kind of
Yeah.
over time.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The thing that really separates true totalitarian regimes is that they don't just want to rule. They want to completely transform society according to a very specific ideology.
Okay, so that's where you get like Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union.
Exactly. Those are the classic examples.
And that ideology becomes like everything, right? It justifies everything that the state does, no matter how brutal.
Yeah.
Which I guess brings us to another characteristic, which is like suppression of dissent. These regimes use any means necessary to eliminate opposition.
Oh, yeah. Terror, violence, propaganda, you name it. It's about crushing any voice that dares to even question the state's ideology or methods.
Right. Okay. So it goes beyond like just silencing your political opponents.
Oh, absolutely. Totalitarian regimes, they want to control all social institutions, religion, family, education, everything becomes a tool of the state.
So it's like they're literally building a whole new society from scratch based on their ideology.
Yeah, you could say that, yeah.
And I guess to maintain that control, that's where you see a lot of these like uh, unpredictable police operations.
Oh, yeah, that's key, right? And actually, that's a very important difference between a totalitarian state and what we would call just a police state.
Wait, there's a difference. I always kind of thought those were basically the same thing.
Yeah, it's a subtle difference, but it's important. A police state, it might be super oppressive, but, there are usually some predictable rules, some semblance of order. In a totalitarian state, though, the police, they kind of operate with almost unlimited and unpredictable power. And that creates this constant atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, making people even less likely to even think about challenging the regime.
Oh, I see what you mean. So it's like you're always walking on eggshells.
Exactly. Never knowing what might trigger, like, a crackdown.
Oh, wow. Okay. And so to make things even more, I guess, complex, they also often create these facade institutions that mimic the ones that we see in democracies.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So you might have elections or a parliament, but, it's all completely controlled by the ruling party.
It's all smoke and mirrors. It's all about creating an illusion of choice and participation, making people feel like they have a say when, behind the scenes, the ruling party has absolute control.
Right. But how is this different from, like, other forms of autocracy? Like, I mean, like a dictatorship. Don't they all kind of basically boil down to one person or a small group having all the power?
Yeah, that's a good question, and this is where I think it gets really interesting. Dictatorships and other forms of autocracy are primarily focused on just controlling political power. Totalitarianism, though, goes so much deeper. It's about controlling every facet of life, public and private, like we said.
It's not just about who makes the laws, it's about, like, reshaping society itself.
Exactly, exactly. Totalitarian regimes, they want to change the world. They actually want to change human nature itself according to their ideology.
That's a little scary.
It is. It's definitely, that's what makes it so unique and kind of terrifying in a way.
It is. And it gets pretty messy when we actually try to classify regimes as, like, totalitarian or not. Our sources talk about this debate between traditionalist and revisionist historians. So basically, they just disagree on, like, how much control is enough to qualify as totalitarian.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex debate for sure. Traditionalists, they tend to focus more on kind of the top-down structures of control, the institutions, the propaganda, the the violence and all that.
Yeah.
But revisionists, they argue that social forces and popular support, they also play a very significant role in shaming these regimes.
I see. So it's not just about, like, the leaders dictating everything. It's also about how society responds.
Yeah, how they kind of, push back or sometimes even, support. And that leads to all these really interesting questions about how efficient these regimes actually were. Were they these perfectly oiled machines of control that, that they often projected themselves as? Or was there, kind of more chaos and resistance bubbling under the surface?
Right. Yeah, it really makes you wonder how much we don't know about how these regimes actually function.
Exactly.
But before we, like, go too far down that rabbit hole, maybe
Mm.
we should take a step back and trace back, like, where did this word even come from? Totalitarianism.
Oh, yeah. It's a word with a very kind of winding history.
Oh, really? Yeah. So the word totalitario, it was actually first used by an Italian anti-fascist.
Oh, wow. So not by the fascists themselves.
No, ironically not, yeah. It was Giovanni Amendola, and he used it to describe Mussolini's regime.
Huh. So Mussolini didn't, like, come up with that as a badge of honor or something?
No, but he later adopted the term and kind of put his own positive spin on it,
Oh.
to really emphasize the unity and absolute power of, his fascist state.
It's really interesting how a word can just, like, change meaning depending on who's using it.
Oh, yeah, the power of language.
Yeah.
But even though the word, it has these roots in Italian fascism, the term totalitarianism, as we kind of understand it today, it really took shape during the Cold War.
Okay, so that's when it really, like, entered the global stage.
You could say that, yeah. The Cold War really solidified this concept of totalitarianism in the West. It became the lens through which they viewed the Soviet Union and its allies.
Oh, okay. So that's, I
Go.
guess, where we'll pick up next time. That sounds good. We'll delve into how the Cold War shaped our understanding of this very complex and honestly kind of chilling form of government.
Sounds good to me. I can't wait.
Welcome back, everyone. So last time we were talking about the term totalitarianism and how it was starting to, gain traction, especially when we get to the Cold War. I'm guessing things got a lot more intense when the Soviet Union entered the picture.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, totalitarianism during the Cold War became way more than just, a description of a government. It became this really powerful tool to understand and critique, the Soviet Union, its allies, its ideology.
So it wasn't just like academics debating in their ivory tower anymore. It was like real world politics.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It had real-world implications, for sure.
And didn't someone even come up with like a whole model for analyzing these totalitarian regimes, like to try to define it more?
Yeah. So you had Carl Friedrich and Zbigniew Brzezinski, these two political scientists. They developed what they called the totalitarian model.
Good.
And they basically outlined 6 key characteristics of a totalitarian regime. A single-party state, obviously, driven by a really powerful ideology, the use of terror and violence to, keep people in line, monopoly on weapons, only the state has the guns, total control over communication, so, propaganda, censorship, the whole 9 yards, and a centrally controlled economy. So, the government controlled all the resources.
Wow. Okay. So they covered all the bases there. Control over the military, the message, the money, and, of course, the minds of the people.
Yeah, pretty much. It was a pretty comprehensive model.
But, I mean, I got to imagine, like, this model probably faced some criticism, too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, could it really, like, capture the full complexity of a society like the Soviet Union? It just seems, I don't know.
You're right to question that. I mean, while it was a really helpful model for understanding kind of like the overall structure and aims of regimes like the USSR, it did tend to, maybe oversimplify things a bit.
Right.
And critics would say that, it didn't really account for the nuances of everyday life under totalitarian rule.
Right. I see what you mean. So it's like a good starting point, but maybe needed some like refining
Exactly.
to really understand like how people were actually experiencing it and living under it.
Yeah, and this is actually where this thing called Kremlinology comes in.
Kremlinology, what is that? So basically, this was like a whole field of study. Like people dedicated their lives to this, right? They were trying to analyze the inner workings of the Soviet political system. Like they were trying to, decode their policies and figure out who was really calling the shots, like who's really in charge here.
It sounds like they were trying to piece together like a giant puzzle.
It was, and it was a puzzle with very, very high stakes.
I bet. I mean, did they ever figure it out?
They definitely made some important insights, but I think the more they studied, the more complex the picture actually became.
Oh, really? Yeah. And, after Stalin's death, you had this group of what they called revisionist historians.
All right.
And they really started to challenge this traditional view of the USSR as this kind of like totally monolithic, top-down totalitarian state.
So they were pushing back against that idea that like the Soviet regime had this like absolute unchallenged control over like everything and everyone.
Exactly. They were saying, look, even in a system as oppressive as the Soviet Union, there were still these pockets of dissent. There were different interpretations of the ideology. There were these like subtle ways that people resisted or, actually shaped the system from below.
Right, because even in the most controlling environments, like people find a way to like, express themselves.
They do. They find a way to push back, to kind of carve out a little bit of freedom for themselves. It's human nature.
It is, yeah. So, okay, if the Cold War was like the defining moment for this concept of totalitarianism, where does that leave us today? I mean, do we still see like truly totalitarian regimes in the 21st century?
I mean, that's a question that sparks a lot of debate. Some scholars, they argue that regimes like North Korea, Eritrea, they exhibit a lot of these classic characteristics that we've been talking about. The suppression of dissent, the personality cults around their leaders, complete control of information, and this kind of pervasive fear among the population.
Yeah. It's a chilling thought that those kinds of regimes still exist. But what about groups like the Taliban or ISIS? I mean, they're obviously brutal, they're controlling, but do they fit the definition?
That's a really complex issue. Some people, they argue that, their focus on religious fundamentalism and this desire to kind of like return to a past social order, it makes them really distinct from those more forward-looking secular ideologies of like the traditional totalitarian regimes.
So instead of like trying to create this like new man, like, the Nazis or the Soviets, they're kind of trying to just like recreate this very specific vision of the past.
Yeah, exactly. They're looking backwards instead of forwards. And that distinction, I think, makes some people hesitant to label them as totalitarian in the same way that we would with, a regime like Stalin's USSR.
Okay.
But regardless of the label, I think there's no denying that these groups pose a very serious threat to individual freedom and human rights.
Absolutely. But even beyond these like specific examples, I think like a lot of people today are worried about like the potential for like new technologies to be used for totalitarian ends.
Oh, yeah. That's a huge concern, right? I mean, think about the possibilities for surveillance and control with things like facial recognition, big data, artificial intelligence. It's kind of scary when you think about it.
Yeah, it sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, like some dystopian future.
Right.
So how do we even grapple with that?
I think it starts with awareness. We need to be informed about how our data is being collected, how it's being used, how algorithms are shaping our online experiences, and how these technologies can be exploited for, both good and bad purposes.
So it's not just about being like afraid of technology. It's about like actually understanding how it works.
Yeah, and demanding transparency, demanding accountability from the people who control these technologies.
Because, I mean, if we're not careful, those freedoms can like just erode away without us even realizing it.
It's the boiling frog analogy, right?
And
They drop a frog in boiling water, it jumps right out. But if you slowly heat up the water, the frog won't even notice the danger until it's too late.
Oh, wow. That's a little disturbing, but very true.
It is. And that's why it's so important to be aware of the dangers of like unchecked power, the suppression of dissent, the manipulation of information, the gradual erosion of individual rights. These things, they don't just happen overnight.
Right. They start small, and then I guess if they're not stopped, they can just like snowball into something really bad.
Exactly.
So, I mean, understanding like how totalitarian regimes come to power, like what tactics they use, the ideologies that they promote. It's not just about history. It's about safeguarding our own freedoms in the present.
I think that's a really important point to remember.
Yeah,
It's not just an academic exercise. It's about protecting ourselves, protecting our societies.
totally. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's about being like vigilant and engaged,
Yeah.
not just about the big obvious threats, but also like those subtle ways in which control can kind of like creep into our lives.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings us back to like the heart of this whole deep dive, understanding totalitarianism and why it's still relevant even in the 21st century.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into totalitarianism.
We have from, it's a pretty chilling definition to the historical examples and the debates and all the potential for like, could it come back in our digital age? It's been a lot. Yeah, it has. It's been a really fascinating and I think thought-provoking journey.
For sure.
But I think before we wrap up, I want to kind of connect all of this back to, you, the listener. Like, why should we care about this? Especially if, all those classic examples feel like kind of a distant past. What do you think?
Yeah, that's the question, right? Like, why does this matter to me? And I think, it's easy to kind of think of totalitarianism as this thing that happened over there or back then. But I think studying it actually helps us recognize, those little subtle warning signs, those ways in which control, manipulation can creep into any society, even our own.
Right, yeah. No one wants to live under a totalitarian regime, but like the erosion of freedom, it often happens gradually,
It
right?
does. It's almost imperceptible. Like you don't see it coming.
It's like that frog in boiling water thing.
Exactly.
You drop a frog in boiling water, it jumps right out.
Mm.
But if you slowly heat the water, it doesn't notice the danger until it's too late.
Sadly, that's a pretty good analogy for how these things can happen. And that's why it's so important to be aware of the dangers, Unchecked power, the suppression of dissent, the manipulation of information, and just the gradual erosion of individual rights. Like, these things don't happen overnight.
No, they start small.
Yeah.
And then,
They snowball.
yeah, it's scary. So, understanding how these regimes come to power, what tactics they use, the ideologies they promote, it's not just history. It's about safeguarding our own freedoms right now.
100%. We need to be critical thinkers, question authority, demand transparency from our leaders, and stand up for those whose voices are being silenced, Like,
Yeah.
we can't just sit back and let this happen.
Well said. And speaking of powerful messages, I kind of wanted to revisit some of the key takeaways, like what really stuck with you from this whole deep dive.
I think that quote by Mussolini, the all within the state, none outside the state, none against the state. It's just so, so powerful. And it really does, in a nutshell, it captures the essence of totalitarianism.
Yeah.
That desire for absolute control, like over every single aspect of life.
Yeah. It's definitely chilling. And I think for me, the debate between, traditionalist and revisionist historians, that was like the thing that was really interesting. It reminds us that even defining totalitarianism, it's not this simple thing.
Yeah. There's just so many layers of complexity and nuance to these regimes and how they function and how people experience them.
Yeah, and I think it highlights how important it is to consider multiple perspectives,
And not just be stuck in one way of thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, history is not black and white.
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought. What are those like subtle signs of control that maybe we're overlooking in our own societies?
Yeah, what are we missing? What's right in front of us? Are we becoming too comfortable with, constant surveillance? Are we, like, letting algorithms and echo chambers shape our online experiences? Are we letting fear and apathy silence our voices? Like, these are questions that I think we all need to be asking ourselves.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Because the legacy of totalitarianism, it's this stark reminder of what can happen when we fail to be vigilant, in defense of our freedoms.
It can happen anywhere, anytime, if we're not careful.
Protecting those freedoms, it requires constant awareness,
Yeah.
critical thinking, the courage to speak out against injustice.
It's a constant struggle, but it's a struggle worth having.
Absolutely. So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for a world where individual liberty
Well
flourishes.
said. I'll second that.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, stay curious.